The deadly job of a Victorian-era baker. Before dawn, the heat awaits. If you lived in Victorian London during the late 19th century, chances are the warm loaf of bread on your breakfast table carried a hidden story, one baked in sweat, soot, and a faint haze of poison. Long before the city stirred awake, bakers began their day in the dead of night, moving through streets still damp with fog and horse dung, lanterns flickering weakly against the gaslights that barely pushed back the darkness. You would have smelled the warm, yeasty air drifting from the bakehouses hours before sunrise, but few ever saw the men and boys who made it happen. Baking bread in this era was no small affair. The demand was relentless. Bread was not simply food. It was the staple, the center of every poor family's diet. In Britain, bread accounted for nearly 50 to 70% of daily caloric intake for working-class families. That meant bakeries had to operate almost continuously, and the bakers themselves lived on schedules entirely opposite from the rest of society. Their working day began not with the morning sun, but with the last flickers of the previous day's lamps. Many bakeries were small, family-run operations tucked into cramped alleyways. Others were industrial bakehouses, enormous hot rooms powered by coal-fired ovens that could bake hundreds of loaves at once. In both cases, bakers typically started their shifts around midnight or 1 a.m. By the time you woke up for breakfast, they had already been working for 5 to 6 hours. The heat of the Victorian oven. The heart of every bakehouse was its oven, and these were nothing like modern steel ovens with precise temperature knobs. Victorian bakers used brick-lined, coal, or wood-fired ovens that retained heat through thermal mass. First, the oven was heated for hours with burning coal, often reaching internal temperatures of 500 to 600 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 to 315 degrees Celsius. Once heated, the ashes were swept out, and loaves were quickly slid in using long wooden peels. The bakers worked bare-armed in stifling heat, even during winter. In summer, conditions became brutal. Temperatures inside the bakehouse could soar well above 38 to 40 degrees Celsius, 100 to 105 degrees Fahrenheit. The only ventilation often came from a small, sooty window or a propped open door, not for comfort, but simply to keep the air breathable. One London inspector described bakehouses as damp, low-ceilinged caverns, where heat and smoke gather like ghosts. Bakers would sweat profusely as they kneaded dough for hours, sometimes fainting from the intense environment. It was common for workers to strip down to undershirts and roll up their trousers, their skin covered in a thin layer of flour that clung to their sweat like plaster dust. Grueling schedules. Victorian bakers often worked 16 to 18 hours a day, 6 days a week. Many lived above or behind the bakery, collapsing into bed only after delivering the morning bread to customers. Journeyman bakers, often young men in their late teens or 20s, slept in cramped quarters near the ovens, sometimes on flour sacks, so they could wake quickly if more loaves needed to be baked during the day. Apprentices had it worse. Young boys as young as 12 or 13 were indentured to bakers for years, working for little more than room and board. They were often tasked with hauling sacks of flour, cleaning ovens, and kneading dough. Exhausting, repetitive tasks done under the watchful eye of a master baker who could be stern or cruel. Sleep was scarce. One early 19th century observer described apprentice life as a slow burning away of boyhood, kneaded into the bread like unseen hands. Invisible dangers, the alum problem. Perhaps the most sinister aspect of Victorian baking was what went into the bread. To keep flour white and make loaves look larger and more appealing, many bakers added alum, a compound of aluminum and potassium. It was cheap, and it allowed lower quality flour to appear fine and pure. But alum was also toxic in large quantities, leading to digestive issues, malnutrition, and in some cases chronic poisoning. Alum bread was widespread, particularly among poorer families who relied on the cheapest loaves. Bakers were under pressure from millers and wholesalers to maintain appearances, and regulations were lax. Bread adulteration became so rampant that it spurred public investigations and parliamentary reports in the mid-19th century. For the baker, however, handling alum and other additives day after day came with its own risks. Fine alum dust mixed with flour, coating lungs and skin. Over time, bakers developed chronic respiratory conditions, digestive problems, and skin irritations. It was a silent danger, overshadowed by the more visible heat and exhaustion of the job. If you walked into a Victorian bakehouse after dark, you might not be alone. Rats were frequent visitors, drawn to the sacks of flour, crumbs, and warmth. Bakers sometimes kept cats on the premises, but infestations were common. Flour was stored in wooden bins or simple canvas sacks, offering little protection. The mingling of rodent droppings, flour dust, and alum created an environment that was, by modern standards, shockingly unsanitary. A world apart, bakers lived in a parallel rhythm to the rest of Victorian society. While others bustled through the streets at midday, bakers were often trying to catch a few hours of sleep in small rooms above the bakery. Their windows were often closed to block the noise of the streets, making these rooms stuffy and airless. It was not uncommon for bakers to suffer from chronic fatigue, insomnia, and other health problems due to their inverted schedules. Despite their essential role in feeding cities, bakers were rarely celebrated. Their work was hidden, routine, and thankless, but indispensable. Every loaf told a story not of leisure, but of labor carried out in the darkest, hottest hours before dawn. As you imagine the soft crackling of coal, the heavy smell of yeast, and the dim light of a single lantern in a flour-dusted room, consider this. What hidden costs lay beneath the crust of the daily bread, both for those who baked it and for those who consumed it? Bread, sweat, and regulation. A city awakens. By the time the first rays of dawn slipped through the sooty haze that hovered over Victorian London, the bakers were already several hours deep into their relentless rhythm. You might imagine the romantic scent of fresh bread drifting lazily through cobblestone streets. And in truth, that scent was there. But behind it lay the mechanical precision of a workforce struggling against exhaustion, heat, and a growing web of regulations that sought to control what they baked, when they baked, and even how they lived. The early morning hours were the busiest. Loaves had to be finished, cooled just enough to be carried without burning fingers, and distributed to households, markets, and street vendors. Journeymen and apprentices, their eyes heavy with fatigue, hoisted baskets and crates, weaving through narrow alleys toward bustling markets where Londoners would gather for their daily bread. The city was awakening. and with it came inspection, scrutiny, and sometimes conflict. The Bakers' Act and the night work debate. For much of the 19th century, the British Parliament grappled with how to regulate the baking industry. The Bakers' Act of 1822 had attempted to limit night work, under the belief that overnight baking was unhealthy and exploitative. Reformers argued that night work ruined men's health, deprived apprentices of sleep and education, and created conditions ripe for abuse. Bakers, however, often resisted these regulations. Night baking was the backbone of the industry. Without it, there would be no fresh bread for morning meals, a cultural and economic necessity. Enforcement was inconsistent, and the law was widely ignored. Journeymen sometimes reported their masters for violating the law, but just as often they participated in the same system, because their livelihood depended on it. Throughout the 1830s and 1840s, the debate grew louder. Public health officials, moral reformers, and labor advocates pushed for tighter regulation. Master bakers, especially in cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool, argued that the economics simply didn't allow for daytime-only baking. By mid-century, the Bakers' Regulation Act of 1863 sought to improve conditions, especially for apprentices, by setting limits on hours and work practices. But enforcement was again uneven. Inspectors were few, and the bakery trade was deeply entrenched in informal customs. The ovens didn't stop because Parliament passed a law. Apprentices, the sleepless youth. For the young apprentices, regulation meant little. These boys, some barely teenagers, were indentured to their masters for years. Their contracts often bound them to live on the premises, sleep where they worked, and perform whatever tasks were required. Imagine a 13-year-old boy waking at midnight, stumbling bleary-eyed into a flour-dusted room, and immediately heaving a 50-kilogram sack of flour onto his narrow shoulders. He would then knead dough for hours, scrub the floors, tend to the fires, and carry loaves to customers. Sleep, when it came, was snatched in brief, uneven intervals, often on makeshift beds in upper rooms heated by the ovens below. Accidents were common. In the dim light of lanterns, boys would burn their arms on oven doors, stumble under heavy loads, or inhale clouds of flour dust that irritated lungs and eyes. Many developed chronic respiratory problems, sometimes referred to colloquially as baker's lung, a condition worsened by poor ventilation. Abuse was not uncommon. Some masters were fair and treated apprentices like family, but others were harsh disciplinarians. Historical accounts describe apprentices being beaten for dropping loaves, mocked for exhaustion, or punished for oversleeping, even when they had worked through most of the previous night. The isolation of the bakehouse made such abuses easy to hide. The flour supply chain, a dusty economy. Beneath the labor struggles lay another layer of complexity, the flour itself. Victorian bakers were dependent on millers and merchants, and this supply chain was often unregulated, unpredictable, and adulterated. Flour arrived in large canvas sacks, often stored in damp warehouses before reaching the bakery. Mold, insects, and contamination were frequent problems. Some bakers sifted their flour meticulously, using fine mesh screens to remove weevils and debris. Others simply mixed everything in, especially in poorer neighborhoods where customers could not afford to be choosy. Then came alum, and sometimes chalk, added to whiten the flour and disguise inferior quality. Millers might add it, or bakers themselves would, under pressure to produce pure white loaves that looked appealing to customers. In middle-class neighborhoods, whiteness became a status symbol. The paler the bread, the wealthier the household. Darker, coarser bread was associated with poverty. For bakers, this meant navigating a delicate balance between profit, reputation, and risk. Using alum could make a loaf appear beautiful and sellable, but overuse risked sickness, and if caught by inspectors, fines or closure. Yet, without additives, low-quality flour could ruin batches, waste time, and drive away customers. It was a silent economic war fought loaf by loaf. Bakehouses as homes and prisons. Because bakers lived where they worked, the bakery was both workplace and home, often to several individuals. A small family bakery might house a master, his wife, children, one or two journeymen, and one or two apprentices, all sharing cramped rooms above the hot, noisy bakehouse. Ventilation was poor, and walls were often stained with smoke from the ovens below. Rooms smelled permanently of yeast, ash, and sweat. Personal privacy was rare. Journeymen sometimes lodged in windowless attics, sleeping beside sacks of flour or wooden crates. This arrangement created tight social bonds, but also trapped individuals in their work cycles. There was little separation between labor and rest. The sound of kneading, the crackle of fire, and the rhythmic thump of wooden peels sliding loaves in and out of the oven were constant companions, even in the rare hours of rest. Some bakers spoke of developing an uncanny sense of time, not by the sun, which they rarely saw, but by the feel of dough, the heat of the oven, or the sounds of distant carriages passing in the early hours. Their lives ran on an internal clock shaped by bread, not daylight. Inspectors and scandals. As the century progressed, public health inspectors began to appear more frequently. Urbanization brought diseases, and the link between food quality and public health became harder to ignore. Inspectors would sometimes arrive unannounced, examining flour sacks, peering into ovens, and even tasting loaves for traces of alum. Reports surfaced of bakers mixing their dough barefoot, standing in troughs to knead it, their sweat and dust mingling with the flour. These revelations shocked middle-class consumers and fueled calls for reform. Newspapers occasionally published sensational exposés with headlines like "Foul bread for the masses" or "Poison in the loaf." For bakers, inspections were both a threat and a nuisance. Some bribed inspectors, others cleaned frantically before inspections, and many simply hoped to escape notice. The vast number of small bakehouses made thorough oversight nearly impossible. A city dependent on the sleepless. Despite the controversies, Victorian cities depended entirely on bakers. Without their night labor, markets would stall, households would scramble for food, and the entire rhythm of urban life would falter. Bread was not a luxury. It was the backbone of daily sustenance. Each morning, as the city stirred, carriages clattered, and shops opened, countless Londoners tore into crusty loaves without giving a moment's thought to the sleepless figures who had produced them. Behind every slice lay the unseen machinery of human bodies bent to the rhythm of coal-fired ovens. As regulations tightened and the economy shifted, a quiet question began to rise among reformers and bakers alike. Could the system ever change, or was the nocturnal, exhausting life of the baker simply the price of daily bread? The slow burn, health, hardship, and quiet revolt. As the 19th century pressed on, the life of the Victorian baker did not become easier. Industrialization was transforming cities, railways were shrinking distances, and technology was creeping into every corner of daily life. Yet inside the bakehouse, time seemed almost frozen. The same coal-fired ovens roared through the night, the same dusty air filled workers' lungs, and the same punishing schedules continued to grind men and boys down year after year. For most bakers, the job was not a noble calling but a grueling means of survival, carried out in anonymity. Bread may have been sacred to the British diet, but the bakers themselves lived on society's margins, bound by exhaustion, habit, and tradition. The physical toll, a life needed away. The human body was never meant to endure the unrelenting heat and rhythm of Victorian bakehouses. Bakers stood for hours without pause, often in temperatures higher than a summer's day in the tropics. Their skin was perpetually slick with sweat and flour dust. Their backs ached from heaving flour sacks and bending over low counters. Their lungs wheezed from inhaling fine particles of flour, coal soot, and alum. Many developed chronic respiratory conditions that physicians would later group under the vague label of baker's lung. Without modern masks or ventilation, each breath drew in irritants. A persistent cough was so common among bakers that it became an unremarkable part of the trade. Burns were another hazard. With ovens glowing at over 500 degrees Fahrenheit, 260 degrees Celsius, one misstep could sear skin in an instant. Bakers often worked bare-armed and sometimes barefoot, particularly apprentices kneading dough in troughs with their feet to soften massive batches. Their hands and forearms bore a constellation of scars, each one a mark of proximity to relentless heat. Then there was sleep deprivation, a quieter, more insidious threat. Working nights inverted their natural rhythms. Many slept in short, irregular bursts, often during the warmest part of the day, in stifling attic rooms above the bakehouse. The combination of heat, noise, and poor ventilation meant sleep was light and restless. Over time, chronic exhaustion set in, weakening immune systems and shortening lifespans. Invisible contaminants, bread as a vector. Victorian bread was often anything but pure, and bakers were caught in the middle. Millers sometimes delivered flour already mixed with alum or chalk, but many bakers themselves added whitening agents to meet customer expectations for bright, white loaves. In addition to alum, some unscrupulous bakers used plaster of Paris, calcium sulfate, or powdered bones to stretch their flour supplies. Others mixed in old, stale dough to keep costs down. These practices were not necessarily seen as criminal at the time. They were common, even expected, especially in poorer neighborhoods. The irony was bitter. Bakers were physically harmed by the same substances they were pressured to use. The fine powders they inhaled while mixing or kneading contributed to chronic stomach issues, skin irritations, and respiratory disease. Yet, without these additives, many bakeries would have gone out of business. For customers, the consequences were equally severe. Prolonged ingestion of alum could lead to digestive problems, malnutrition, or worse, especially among children whose diets depended heavily on bread. Bread was cheap, filling, and deadly in slow doses. Man-standing journeymen and the seeds of resistance. Among the journeymen, skilled bakers who worked for masters rather than owning their own shops, resentment simmered. They were the backbone of the trade, but their lives were tightly controlled. Journeymen were required to live on site, follow punishing schedules, and abide by the whims of their masters. Their wages were modest, and their prospects of rising to become masters themselves were limited by overcrowding in the trade. In the 1830s and 1840s, journeyman bakers began forming associations and informal unions, especially in London. These groups were not merely about wages, they were about sleep. Their central demand was the abolition of night work, which they saw as destructive to health and family life. One London journeyman's pamphlet from 1848 declared, "We ask not for riches, but for the morning light. We are men who work while others sleep, and we perish by inches in the heat of the night." Their agitation coincided with broader labor movements of the era. Petitions were sent to Parliament, public speeches were made, and some journeymen even staged brief strikes. Master bakers fought back, warning that abolishing night work would disrupt bread supply and ruin small businesses. The public was torn. They sympathized with the exhausted workers, but they wanted their bread fresh at breakfast. Technology creeps in, the steam oven. By the mid to late 19th century, steam-powered ovens and mechanized kneading machines began appearing in large urban bakehouses. These innovations promised efficiency, and to some, hope. Steam ovens heated more evenly and required less manual labor to maintain temperature. Machines could knead massive batches of dough in less time than human hands. But for the average baker, especially the small family operator, these machines were too expensive. Industrial bakeries began to dominate the trade in major cities, employing dozens of workers on shift rotations. Smaller bakeries either adapted or faded. This technological shift slowly altered the rhythm of baking. In larger facilities, work could be distributed across teams, softening, but not eliminating, the brutality of night work. For many journeymen, however, this simply meant moving from one grueling environment to another, from small, intimate bakehouses to vast, hot, industrial halls. Public health and scandal. Meanwhile, the issue of bread adulteration refused to go away. Throughout the mid-1800s, medical officers and chemists conducted investigations into London's bread supply. In 1855, the famous chemist Arthur Hill Hassall published damning reports on alum and chalk in bread, prompting public outrage. Newspapers carried lurid illustrations of bakers dumping white powder into mixing troughs, feeding the image of a trade riddled with deceit. Parliament eventually responded with the Adulteration of Food Act of 1860, followed by stronger versions in 1872 and 1875. These laws made it illegal to add harmful substances to food, including bread. Inspectors gained more power to seize samples and prosecute offenders. Yet even these measures could not entirely erase the deep-set habits of the trade. Many bakers had learned their craft in a world where alum use was normal. Shifting away from it required new flour supplies, new techniques, and new consumer expectations. Change was slow, uneven, and resisted by economic realities. Women and the bakehouse. Although baking was predominantly male in Victorian England, women played crucial supporting roles, often without recognition. In family-run bakeries, wives and daughters managed the shop front, handled accounts, and occasionally assisted with shaping loaves or preparing pastries. They lived in the same heat and noise as their husbands, raising children above the bakehouse while the ovens roared below. Some women became informal inspectors of sorts, keeping an eye on apprentices, managing cleanliness, or smoothing over conflicts between workers. Their labor, though rarely documented, kept many small bakehouses functioning in a delicate balance of domestic and industrial life. An unchanged night. Despite technological shifts, regulatory acts, and sporadic resistance, the core experience of the Victorian baker persisted well into the late 19th century. The night remained their domain. When the rest of the city slept, they were awake, tending fires, shaping loaves, inhaling flour, and pushing their bodies to the limits of endurance. The city depended on them utterly, yet barely noticed them. They were like the gaslights that burned through the night, essential, constant, and taken for granted. And so, in the long, quiet hours before dawn, among sacks of flour and glowing embers, one could ask, was this nocturnal toil inevitable, or could the rhythm of bread itself ever be changed? Crust and legacy, the enduring echo of the night baker. By the final decades of the 19th century, the Victorian baker stood at a crossroads between tradition and transformation. The rhythms of their labor had been etched into the fabric of urban life for over a century, as natural to the city as fog on the Thames or the rattle of horse-drawn carts on cobblestones. Yet, winds of change were stirring. Public health reforms, mechanization, shifting tastes, and a growing labor consciousness were slowly reshaping the way bread was made and consumed. The world outside the bakehouse was changing. Inside, the heat, sweat, and exhaustion remained much the same. Industrialization, a new kind of bakery. Large industrial bakehouses began to rise in major cities during the late Victorian era. Fueled by steam power and, later, early forms of gas heating, these factories could produce bread on a scale unimaginable to the small family-run bakeries of earlier decades. Shift work became more common, allowing some bakers to avoid the harshest overnight hours. Machines could mix, knead, and bake faster and more consistently than human hands. Ovens were designed to maintain stable temperatures without the constant tending that coal and wood required. This brought both relief and dislocation. For some bakers, it meant regular wages, shorter hours, and a less punishing physical environment. For others, especially independent masters and journeymen accustomed to the intimate rhythms of their neighborhood bakehouses, it meant the erosion of autonomy. Industrial bakeries were often impersonal, crowded, and strictly hierarchical. Bakers became wage laborers in someone else's enterprise, their craft subsumed into mechanized efficiency. Family bakeries continued to survive, especially in smaller towns and rural communities, but the tide was turning. Bread was becoming standardized, and the industrial loaf was on the rise. Public health reforms take hold. The battle against adulterated bread reached a turning point with the Adulteration of Food Acts of the 1860s and 1870s. These laws, along with increasing scrutiny from journalists and chemists, began to purge alum and chalk from Britain's bread supply. Public awareness campaigns emphasized pure bread as both a moral and medical issue. Middle-class housewives were urged to demand better quality from their bakers. Inspectors gained more authority to confiscate contaminated loaves. Over time, this created a feedback loop. Millers were pressured to produce cleaner flour, and bakers had less incentive to add whitening agents. For bakers, this meant adapting to new expectations. Some struggled. They had spent their entire careers using alum and chalk, and customers had grown accustomed to unnaturally white bread. Others embraced the change, marketing their loaves as honest, pure, or unadulterated. The reforms did not erase the punishing labor conditions, but they reduced the hidden toxicities that had made Victorian bread literally deadly. Labor movements and the fading of night work. The journeyman bakers' agitation did not immediately abolish night work, but it planted seeds that would sprout in the following century. By the early 20th century, new labor laws, unionization, and industrial bakery shift systems gradually softened the tyranny of the midnight oven. Night baking did not disappear entirely. Even today, bakeries often begin in the early hours to meet demand, but the relentless, lifelong nocturnal existence of Victorian bakers slowly faded. Journeymen's associations evolved into more formal trade unions, negotiating hours and wages in ways that would have been unthinkable earlier in the century. As public health and industrial innovation advanced, the image of the sleepless baker became a symbol of both sacrifice and obsolescence, that a human rhythm carved by bread. For over a century, bakers had lived and died by the rhythm of bread. Their days began when the city's lights dimmed. They inhaled flour before breakfast, sweated through nights others spent in dreams, and shaped loaves that would fuel factory workers, soldiers, families, and orphans alike. In many ways, the Victorian baker's existence embodied the hidden human infrastructure behind urban life. Cities may be remembered for their inventors, politicians, or artists, but their daily survival depended on the quiet labor of men and boys working in the shadows, night after night. Their struggles were not heroic in the romantic sense. They were enduring, repetitive, and uncelebrated. But without them, the city would have awoken to empty tables. Modern echoes. Walk through a city before dawn today, and you might catch a faint echo of that past. Somewhere, a small bakery's lights burn in the darkness, and the smell of yeast seeps into the quiet streets. Modern bakers, with their stainless steel ovens and mechanized mixers, still share a kinship with their Victorian predecessors. They too rise when others sleep. They too shape the food that anchors daily life. The difference is that the work has shifted from survival to craft. For many modern bakers, it's a passion, a chosen vocation, rather than an inescapable life sentence. Health standards protect their lungs, regulations safeguard their ingredients, and machines ease their labor. But the night, that ancient companion of the baker, still lingers. Brain reflection. The story of the Victorian baker is not one of grand battles or dramatic upheavals. It is a story of human endurance within a system of necessity. Bread had to be made. Cities had to eat. And so, generation after generation, men and boys sacrificed their health and sleep to keep the ovens burning. Their lives were hot, dusty, and brief, yet their labor nourished millions. The silent persistence of their work reminds us that history is built not only on kings and wars, but on the backs of ordinary people whose contributions fade like steam from a cooling loaf. And so, as the last coal embers fade and the city awakens to warm bread, we are left with a quiet question. How many other invisible labors sustain us each day, unnoticed, like the bakers who worked while the world slept, the nightmen cleaning cities while everyone slept, under the gaslight, the hidden workforce of the Victorian night. When darkness fell over Victorian cities, the respectable citizens retreated indoors. Street lamps flickered to life with weak, yellow flames. Shutters closed against the fog and the cold, and a hush settled over cobblestone streets. But the city did not truly sleep. Beneath the gaslight, a hidden army of laborers emerged. Men who carried the waste of entire populations on their backs, who crept through alleys and courtyards to perform one of the most unpleasant, dangerous, and necessary jobs of the age. They were known as nightmen. You would rarely see their faces in the daylight. Their work took place when respectable society was tucked in bed, precisely because no one wanted to witness it. Nightmen cleaned cesspools, privies, and sewers before the widespread adoption of modern sanitation. They hauled away human waste, animal dung, rotting matter, and runoff that accumulated in pits beneath homes and streets. It was work that kept cities functioning, and it was work that no one wanted to talk about. Before the flush, a city built on cesspools. To understand the nightmen, you first have to imagine a world before flush toilets. By the early Victorian period, mid-1800s, water closets were slowly spreading among the wealthy, but the vast majority of urban residents still relied on privies, simple outdoor toilets that emptied into pits dug beneath the ground. These pits, or cesspools, were meant to collect waste until they could be emptied manually. There were no citywide sewage systems to whisk away waste with water. Instead, human excrement soaked slowly into the ground, leached into wells, or sat festering in underground chambers beneath houses. In densely populated cities like London, Manchester, and Liverpool, cesspools filled rapidly. A typical working-class household might share a single privy with several families, and the pit beneath would need to be emptied every few months, sometimes more frequently. Wealthier homes had larger cesspools or more private arrangements, but even they eventually filled. When the time came, the householder would send word, usually by day, to arrange for the nightmen. And when night fell, the night soil was collected. The arrival of the nightmen. The nightmen typically arrived between midnight and 5 a.m., moving through the sleeping city with carts, shovels, buckets, and lanterns. They often worked in teams of 3 to 6 men. One man would descend into the cesspool, while others hauled up the waste and carted it away. Their equipment was simple but effective. A long ladle, a kind of oversized scoop attached to a pole, was used to transfer semi-liquid waste into buckets. For thicker material, shovels and rakes were employed. Ropes and pulleys lifted the heavy buckets out of the pits. The men wore thick, tarred clothing to repel moisture and filth, and some wrapped cloth around their faces to dull the stench, though it rarely helped. Their movements were accompanied by the unmistakable odor of human waste, which drifted through alleys and across quiet streets. Residents sometimes awoke in the night to the sound of scraping, splashing, and muffled shouts, followed by the creak of wooden carts laden with night soil. These carts would then trundle through the dark city toward disposal sites, often fields on the outskirts of town, where the waste was dumped, dried, or even sold as fertilizer to farmers. The smell that defined an era. Contemporary accounts often mention the smell of Victorian cities. Long before modern plumbing and sanitation, urban air carried a permanent undercurrent of rot. Cesspools were the primary culprit. They leaked into cellars, seeped into wells, and overflowed into streets during heavy rains. In hot weather, the stench intensified, clinging to walls and clothing. The nightmen worked inside this world of smell, often standing chest deep in cesspits with only a lantern to light the darkness. Some contemporary observers claimed that nightmen developed a kind of immunity, their noses dulled to the odor over years of exposure. Others noted that many drank heavily before or during shifts to numb their senses. In one 1840 report from Manchester, a sanitary inspector described the nightmen as moving shadows, ankle-deep in the city's foulest recesses, their presence known only by the stench that followed them. For most citizens, these men were barely human in the imagination. Faceless, necessary figures who performed a task both feared and reviled. The business of waste. Surprisingly, night work could be profitable. In many towns, nightmen operated as private contractors, bidding for the right to service a particular district or neighborhood. Wealthier households paid for their cesspools to be emptied discreetly and thoroughly. Poorer neighborhoods often relied on haphazard arrangements or went far too long between cleanings, leading to overflowing pits and public health crises. Nightmen charged by the load or by the volume of the cesspool. They would haul waste to designated dumping grounds. But some also sold the collected material to farmers on the outskirts of the city. Human waste, once dried and processed, could serve as an effective fertilizer, known as night soil. This secondary market turned filth into profit. However, the work was unpredictable. During outbreaks of disease or heavy rains, cesspools filled more quickly, creating intense demand. At other times, competition between nightmen could drive prices down, leading some to dump waste illegally in rivers, ditches, or vacant lots under cover of darkness. Dangers beneath the surface. Nightmen faced significant risks. Entering a cesspit was physically hazardous. The accumulation of decomposing organic matter produced toxic gases like methane and hydrogen sulfide. In enclosed pits, these gases could displace oxygen, causing men to collapse from asphyxiation without warning. Accounts exist of nightmen entering a pit and never coming out, overcome by invisible fumes. The pits themselves were structurally unreliable. Some were hastily dug or poorly maintained. Walls could collapse, burying a worker under tons of liquid waste and earth. Others contained sharp debris, discarded household objects, or dead animals that could injure men working blind in the darkness. Disease was an ever-present threat. Although germ theory was not fully accepted until later in the century, Nightmen knew through experience that their work carried deadly consequences. Many suffered chronic respiratory ailments, skin infections, and digestive problems. Outbreaks of cholera, typhoid, and dysentery, diseases spread through contaminated water and waste, swept through cities in terrifying waves, and nightmen stood at the front line of exposure to a low social standing. Despite their essential role, nightmen were social outcasts. Their association with human waste made them unwelcome in polite company. Some pubs refused to serve them. Others relegated them to separate rooms. Their smell lingered on their clothes and skin, even after washing, marking them as unclean in a deeply class-conscious society. Nightmen often lived on the fringes of urban neighborhoods, in small, cheap lodgings near the dumping grounds or industrial zones. Their work hours set them apart from others, and their profession made them invisible by design. Respectable citizens preferred not to think about cesspools or the men who emptied them. They simply expected their privies to function, much like modern citizens expect their plumbing to. Yet, ironically, their work was indispensable. Without nightmen, cities would have been uninhabitable. Streets would overflow with waste. Groundwater would be poisoned. Disease would spread unchecked. They were, in many ways, the silent foundation of urban hygiene, even before public health authorities fully understood the importance of sanitation. The sleeping city. Picture a London street at 3 a.m. in 1850. Gas lamps flicker in the fog. A horse snorts as it pulls a wooden cart down a narrow lane. 3 men move in the shadows, lanterns swinging, their boots sloshing through damp cobblestones. Behind a row of terraced houses, a trapdoor in the yard is lifted, revealing a dark pit below. One man climbs down a rope ladder, disappearing into the darkness. Another steadies a bucket. A third adjusts the pulley and wipes his brow with a tarred sleeve. There is no applause, no attention, no gratitude. Their work is dirty, silent, and unseen, but it allows the city to wake up clean. As cities grew denser and cesspools multiplied, so too did the challenges faced by the nightmen. The limits of their labor were approaching, and by mid-century, public health crises forced society to confront a pressing question. Could a city of millions survive on cesspools and night soil alone? The weight of waste, labor, law, and the looming crisis. By the middle decades of the 19th century, Victorian cities were growing faster than their waste systems could handle. London, the beating heart of the empire, had swelled to over 2.3 million inhabitants by 1851. Manchester, Liverpool, and other industrial hubs saw similar explosive growth. Factories belched smoke, tenements sprang up like mushrooms after rain, and waves of migrants poured in from the countryside in search of work. But while cities built mills and railways, they failed to build sewers at the same pace. In this rapidly expanding urban world, nightmen became indispensable, but also increasingly overwhelmed. What had once been a grim but manageable occupation was turning into an almost impossible task. Overfilled cesspools, a city reaching capacity. Imagine standing in the back courtyard of a London tenement in 1848. There's a single privy, a small, rough brick structure with a wooden seat, serving dozens of people. Beneath it, a cesspool has been dug, perhaps 6 or 7 feet deep. Initially, It absorbed liquid into the surrounding soil, but as the population grew and waste accumulated, the ground itself became saturated. Once cesspools reached capacity, they simply overflowed. Liquid waste seeped into adjacent basements, cellars, and even kitchens. In some neighborhoods, the ground beneath houses became honeycombed with cesspits, leaking into one another like a network of subterranean swamps. During heavy rains, these pits overflowed into the streets, creating puddles and streams of raw sewage. Nightmen were called to empty these cesspools, but the demand outstripped their ability to respond. There were not enough teams to service the endless pits filling beneath the city. In poorer districts, families often delayed hiring nightmen to save money, allowing cesspools to become dangerously full. By the time a crew was finally summoned, the job was harder, smellier, and more dangerous than a race against time each night. Nightmen operated on a tight, nocturnal schedule. They typically began their rounds after midnight, working through to the early hours before dawn. Their aim was to finish before morning, when the streets filled with milkmen, newspaper boys, market carts, and respectable citizens. The logistics were complicated. Teams had to coordinate the order of houses, the number of cesspools, the distance to dumping grounds, and the availability of carts and horses. In wealthier neighborhoods, discretion was expected. Noisy work or lingering odors could lead to complaints and loss of business. The average cesspool could hold hundreds of gallons of waste. Emptying even one required dozens of bucket loads hoisted by rope and pulley. A team might clear several pits in a night, but in dense districts with overflowing cesspools, they sometimes labored until dawn, their carts laden with reeking night soil, disease, miasma, and fear. Victorians lived in constant tension with the invisible dangers of their cities. Long before germ theory gained acceptance, people feared miasmas, poisonous vapors that were believed to spread disease. Foul smells were equated with sickness. When a cesspool overflowed into a street, neighbors held handkerchiefs over their faces, burned herbs, or simply fled indoors. Nightmen, however, walked directly into these miasmas. They descended into cesspits without protection, surrounded by the strongest concentrations of rot and decay. Many nightmen developed chronic illnesses, but they were rarely recorded in official statistics. Deaths caused by asphyxiation in cesspools or long-term exposure were simply part of the trade. One report from Liverpool in the 1850s described a nightman found unconscious at the bottom of a pit. His colleagues hauled him out, revived him with cold water, and sent him back down within the hour. Cholera, typhoid, and dysentery stalked cities with terrifying regularity. Outbreaks often began in neighborhoods where cesspools were overflowing or close to wells. Nightmen, working at the nexus of waste and water, were frequently exposed before anyone else fell ill. Sanitary reformers and early inspections. By the 1840s and 1850s, a growing number of public health reformers began turning their attention to the night soil system. Figures like Edwin Chadwick, a key advocate for sanitary reform, argued that cesspools and night soil collection were inadequate for modern urban life. Chadwick's famous 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population painted a grim picture. The atmosphere of the poorer quarters is impregnated with the exhalations of cesspools and open drains. The very wells from which the people draw their water are poisoned by their own ordure. Chadwick and his allies pushed for centralized sewer systems, piped water, and the abolition of cesspools. But their ideas faced resistance. Building sewers was expensive, politically complicated, and required tearing up streets, a daunting prospect in already crowded cities. Many property owners resisted reforms, preferring to maintain their cesspools and hire night men, as they always had. Meanwhile, inspectors began surveying cesspools and recording sanitation data. They mapped thousands of pits beneath London and other cities, revealing a hidden world of filth that alarmed even seasoned reformers. These reports made clear that nightmen alone could not sustain urban sanitation for cities of millions. An uneven economy of filth. The night soil trade mirrored the class divisions of Victorian society. In wealthy districts, cesspools were large, well-constructed, and emptied regularly. Nightmen were expected to work quietly and professionally. Their pay was higher, and the work, though filthy, was relatively predictable. In working-class neighborhoods, however, cesspools were often shoddily built, irregularly maintained, and emptied infrequently. Nightmen charged lower rates, but the jobs were harder, riskier, and often performed under miserable conditions. In some slum areas, cesspools were simply abandoned, overflowing continuously into the ground. The disposal of night soil was also shaped by economics. Nightmen could sell collected waste to farmers as fertilizer, but transporting it to the countryside required permits and long journeys. Many chose quicker, illegal methods, dumping into rivers, canals, or vacant lots. This practice contributed to the contamination of drinking water, especially in London, where water companies drew from the Thames, the same river where night soil was sometimes dumped. Crackdowns and conflicts. As sanitary inspectors gained more authority, they began to crack down on illegal dumping, bringing nightmen into conflict with authorities. Fines were levied, licenses were revoked, and some nightmen were arrested. But the system was chaotic. Inspectors were few, cities were vast, and the demand for waste removal never stopped. Some nightmen developed elaborate methods to avoid detection, working in remote alleys, bribing watchmen, or timing their dumping runs to coincide with foggy nights. Others struck informal agreements with local officials, turning enforcement into a kind of shadow economy. At the same time, reformers criticized property owners who neglected their cesspools, arguing that wealthy landlords were partly to blame for disease outbreaks in poor neighborhoods. Nightmen were caught in the middle, simultaneously vilified for their methods and relied upon to keep the city functional. Public outcry and the sanitation debate. By the late 1840s, public patience was wearing thin. Repeated cholera outbreaks, particularly the devastating epidemics of 1832, 1848 to 49, and 1853 to 54, forced politicians to confront the consequences of inadequate sanitation. Newspapers published graphic descriptions of cesspool overflows, contaminated wells, and night soil dumping. Pamphlets circulated calling for modern drainage for a modern city. The night soil system, once accepted as a fact of urban life, began to look like a dangerous relic. Reformers argued that relying on nightmen to manually remove waste was unsustainable for cities with populations in the millions. Modern sewer systems, though costly, promise to solve the problem permanently. Still, many households clung to old habits. Installing water closets required plumbing, reliable water supplies, and structural changes that were out of reach for most working-class families. Even as London began constructing its famous Bazalgette sewer system in the late 1850s, tens of thousands of cesspools remained in use. A city on the brink. By the mid-19th century, Victorian cities stood on the brink of a public health transformation. The nightmen continued their nightly rounds, lanterns swinging in the darkness, even as reformers drafted plans to make their labor obsolete. The weight of waste pressed down on everyone: property owners, city officials, reformers, and especially the nightmen themselves. Each overflowing cesspool, each illegal dumping run, each night of backbreaking labor raised the same question. Could a city survive on night soil alone, or would the very system that sustained it eventually bring it to ruin? Sewers rising. Decline of the night soil system. By the mid-19th century, the nightmen's nocturnal dominion was facing a formidable challenger: the rise of modern sewer systems. What had once seemed an unavoidable reality of urban life, cesspools, night soil carts, and the quiet scraping of buckets at 3 a.m., was about to be transformed by engineering, public health reform, and political will. The nightmen had operated for centuries as a shadow workforce, largely ignored by history. But in the 1850s and 1860s, their world began to unravel, not because society suddenly found their work distasteful, it always had been, but because new technology and new fears finally converged to push Victorian cities towards something radically different. In 1832, Britain experienced its first devastating cholera epidemic, sweeping in from continental Europe. Cholera struck with terrifying speed. One day, a person might feel fine. The next, they would be vomiting, writhing in cramps, and collapsing into near death from dehydration. Entire neighborhoods were struck down within days. At the time, the prevailing theory of disease was miasma, the belief that bad air, especially foul-smelling air, carried sickness. To the Victorian mind, cholera was the inevitable result of rotting cesspools and overflowing privies. People who lived near them, or who inhaled their stench, were thought to be most at risk. In a sense, the theory was not entirely wrong. Cesspools and night soil really were central to cholera, though not because of smell. They contaminated the water supply, but this was not yet widely understood. Nightmen, who worked at the very heart of this system, were among the first to encounter cholera's devastation. They reported emptying cesspools in houses where entire families had suddenly fallen ill, sometimes removing waste while bodies still lay inside the home. Their work became even more dreaded, and their presence was associated with the terror of the epidemic. The 1848 outbreak and the sanitary awakening. The cholera epidemic of 1848 to 49 was even worse. Tens of thousands died in Britain, with London especially hard hit. Reformers like Edwin Chadwick seized on the moment to demand sweeping sanitary reforms. His 1842 report on the sanitary condition of the laboring population had already described cesspools as reservoirs of death, and now the evidence seemed undeniable. Chadwick's solution was not to improve the work of the nightmen, but to replace them entirely with a system of underground pipes, flushing water closets, and central sewers. To him, the night soil trade was an archaic system fit only for small towns, not vast industrial metropolises. Still, change came slowly. Parliament debated, landlords resisted, and cities hesitated to bear the enormous cost. Nightmen continued their rounds, their carts rolling through the gaslit streets while cholera raged. Some reformers accused the nightmen themselves of spreading disease by handling waste, by leaking it from their carts, or by dumping it illegally into rivers. The Thames, London's primary water source, became increasingly polluted with night soil. People joked grimly that the Thames was liquid filth, and that drinking its water was an invitation to death. John Snow and the Broad Street Pump. In 1854, during yet another cholera outbreak, a physician named John Snow conducted his now famous investigation into the Broad Street Pump in Soho. By mapping cases of cholera and interviewing residents, he determined that the disease was waterborne, not airborne. The contaminated water had been tainted by waste from nearby cesspools and sewers. Snow's work challenged the miasma theory directly and placed night soil at the center of the problem. Though not immediately accepted, his findings strengthened the case for comprehensive sewer systems. Nightmen were not blamed personally, but their work became symbolic of a failed system of waste management that could no longer sustain modern cities. The Great Stink of 1858. If cholera had not yet convinced Parliament of the need for change, the summer of 1858 finally did. A hot, dry spell reduced the Thames to a slow-moving sewer, heavy with untreated waste from cesspools, drains, and night soil dumping. The stench was so overpowering that members of Parliament were forced to soak curtains in lime and vinegar just to continue their sessions. Newspapers dubbed it the Great Stink, and the crisis could no longer be ignored. This was the death knell of the night soil system in London. Plans were fast-tracked to build Joseph Bazalgette's Great Sewer Network, a massive feat of Victorian engineering that would channel waste out of the city and into treatment facilities downstream. For the nightmen, this spelled the end of their traditional occupation. Their labor, once indispensable, was becoming obsolete in the capital, nightmen in transition. But the story was not uniform across Britain. Even as London embarked on sewer construction, many smaller towns and rural areas continued to rely on cesspools and night soil. Nightmen remained essential in places where water closets and underground drainage were rare. In these regions, their work continued much as it had for centuries. Waste was still collected by hand, loaded into carts, and hauled away to fields. Farmers continued to buy dried night soil as fertilizer, despite growing public discomfort with the practice. Some nightmen adapted by working for municipalities, emptying public privies, or maintaining the early sewer outfalls. Others shifted to related trades, refuse collection, street cleaning, or manual labor in sanitation works. But the prestige of the job, such as it was, declined further. No one mourned the fading of the traditional nightman's role, a vanishing brotherhood. The nightmen were never a celebrated group, but within their ranks they shared a strong bond of identity. They worked in darkness, endured the same hazards, and carried the same social stigma. Their profession was passed down in families, with sons often joining their fathers. By the 1860s and 1870s, this brotherhood was shrinking. New sewer systems reduced demand. Younger men sought work in factories, railways, or docks instead. Apprenticeships dwindled. The once common sight of night soil carts rolling through gaslit streets grew rarer. In the memories of many Victorians, however, the image of the nightman lingered as a symbol of the old city, a city of smells, shadows, and manual labor, slowly giving way to iron pipes and municipal control. The human cost. It is easy to think of the nightmen only in terms of filth and odor, but their lives carried a heavy human cost. Many suffered shortened lifespans from disease, respiratory illness, or accidents. Their social isolation was profound. Even after leaving the trade, they were often marked by its stigma. Yet, in their anonymity, they kept cities alive. Without them, waste would have overflowed, disease would have spread faster, and urban life would have collapsed. They were the hidden custodians of health, working in silence and shadows, sacrificing dignity for survival. As the gas lamps flickered out and dawn crept across the rooftops of Victorian London, the nightmen trundled home with their empty carts. Their job was nearly done, not just for the night, but for history itself. Soon, their profession would vanish into memory, displaced by the flow of water through new sewers. But before that final transformation, one question haunted reformers and citizens alike. Could cities truly cleanse themselves of their past, or would the legacy of waste continue to shape the future? Pipes, progress, and the fading of the night soil trade. By the late 19th century, the profession of the nightman, once a fixture of nocturnal city life, was slowly disappearing into history. The men who had labored in darkness, waist deep in filth, were being outpaced by pipes, municipal infrastructure, and a new understanding of public health. The transition was neither instant nor universal, but by century's end, the world of night soil collection had been transformed beyond recognition. The rise of the sewer city. The construction of Joseph Bazalgette's sewer system in London during the 1850s and 1860s marked a watershed moment in urban sanitation. Over 80 miles of main sewers and hundreds of miles of smaller pipes were laid beneath the city, channeling waste away from crowded neighborhoods and into outfall systems downstream. This monumental project, one of the greatest civil engineering achievements of its time, fundamentally restructured how cities handled human waste. No longer would cesspools under every house collect and ferment sewage until nightmen came to scoop it out. Instead, waste flowed continuously through underground pipes, aided by flushing water closets, toward massive intercepting sewers. The smell, though never entirely banished, began to retreat from daily urban life. As London led the way, other cities followed. Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, and Glasgow embarked on similar sewer building programs, motivated by public health crises and the persuasive power of sanitary reformers. By the 1870s and 1880s, modern sewerage systems had become a defining feature of urban modernity. For nightmen, this was an existential shift. Their centuries-old role was being replaced not by other workers, but by infrastructure, adapting to a new world. Not all nightmen were swept away overnight. Some found employment in the new sanitation departments, working as sewer laborers, drain cleaners, or maintenance men. These jobs carried their own dangers. Sewers were hazardous places, with poor ventilation and the constant risk of flooding. But they offered steady municipal wages, something the unpredictable night soil trade often lacked. Others shifted into refuse collection, street sweeping, or waterworks maintenance. Their skills with ropes, carts, and heavy manual labor translated naturally to other dirty but necessary urban jobs. A few entrepreneurial nightmen adapted early, offering services to households not yet connected to the sewer system. For decades after London's sewers were built, tens of thousands of cesspools remained in use, especially in poorer districts and older houses where plumbing was too costly. Night soil collection persisted in these pockets well into the late 19th century, albeit on a reduced scale, with fewer men covering larger areas. A new sanitary order. The transformation of waste management in Victorian Britain wasn't just about pipes. It was about a shift in worldview. By the 1870s, the germ theory of disease had begun to supplant miasma theory. People increasingly understood that contaminated water, not bad air, was the real vector for cholera and other deadly illnesses. This new understanding gave sanitary infrastructure moral urgency. Cities saw sewer systems not as luxuries, but as necessities for survival and progress. Public health campaigns emphasized cleanliness. Flushing toilets became symbols of modernity, and cesspools came to be seen as relics of a darker, smellier past. Nightmen, who had once been an invisible necessity, now became visible as anachronisms. Their presence, the lanterns, the carts, the smell, evoked an older city of disease and disorder. Municipal authorities began to regulate and restrict their work more tightly, encouraging households to connect to sewers or install proper plumbing. The decline of night soil as fertilizer. For centuries, human waste had been a valuable resource for farmers. Dried night soil was spread on fields, enriching the soil with nitrogen and phosphorus. This circular economy connected urban waste to rural agriculture, closing a loop between city and countryside. But in the Victorian era, this relationship began to fray. The expansion of chemical fertilizers, improved agricultural methods, and the rise of rail transport meant that artificial fertilizers like guano, imported from South America, and later superphosphates became more accessible and efficient. Night soil was messy, inconsistent, and smelled terrible. Transporting it from urban centers to rural fields became less economical compared to shipping sacks of guano by rail. Gradually, farmers turned away from night soil, and the economic backbone of the night soil trade crumbled. Without buyers, nightmen lost one of their secondary income streams. Even in rural areas, municipal authorities began to view open dumping and drying of night soil as a public health nuisance, tightening regulations and limiting disposal sites. Regulation and erasure. Throughout the latter half of the 19th century, local governments passed a series of public health acts and sanitation bylaws that gradually phased out cesspools. The Public Health Act of 1875, in particular, gave local authorities greater powers to compel property owners to connect to sewer systems and maintain sanitary facilities. Municipal sanitary inspectors expanded their reach, mapping remaining cesspools, issuing notices, and sometimes fining or prosecuting householders who resisted. Nightmen, once informal contractors, found their work increasingly regulated, monitored, and diminished. In cities that completed their sewer systems, night soil collection was eventually banned or absorbed entirely into municipal sanitation departments. The independent nightman, with his lantern and cart, became a thing of the past, the fading of a nocturnal world. By the turn of the 20th century, the nocturnal scenes that had defined Victorian cities were vanishing. The quiet streets after midnight no longer echoed with the creak of night soil carts or the splash of buckets. Gaslights still flickered, but the work taking place beneath them had changed. Sewers carried away the waste silently, underground, unseen. The men who had once labored through the night found their profession relegated to memory, sometimes mocked, sometimes pitted, but rarely honored. Popular literature of the late Victorian and Edwardian periods occasionally referenced nightmen as symbols of the bad old days, often in cautionary or comedic tones. Their very existence became a kind of urban folklore, yet their disappearance was not total. In smaller towns, villages, and colonies of the British Empire, night soil collection persisted into the 20th century, long after cities like London had moved on. In some places, it continued until the interwar period or even after the Second World War, particularly where sewer systems were incomplete or too expensive to build. Reflections on the nightman's legacy. The nightman's story is not glamorous. It is a story of men who worked in the filth of others, often at great personal risk, for modest pay and little respect. They existed in the margins of society, necessary, invisible, and reviled. But their role was essential. Before the age of pipes and pumps, human labor was the infrastructure. It was men with buckets, not machines, who kept cities from drowning in their own waste. Their work laid the foundation, quite literally, for modern urban sanitation. When historians celebrate the triumph of Victorian sewer systems, they often focus on the engineers, reformers, and politicians. But behind their blueprints and speeches were generations of anonymous workers who toiled in darkness to make urban life possible. Their disappearance marked not just a change in technology, but a profound shift in how societies understood cleanliness, disease, and the urban environment, the smell that changed history. Perhaps the most poetic legacy of the nightmen is this. It was the smell of their labor that ultimately drove cities to change. The Great Stink of 1858, the odors that drifted through gaslit streets, the rank air in overcrowded tenements. These sensations moved politicians to act more than any abstract theory. In the end, smell became policy. And with that policy came the end of a way of life that had persisted for centuries. The nightmen faded into history, their lanterns extinguished by the steady flow of water through newly built pipes. The story of the nightmen is a reminder that the foundations of modern life were built by unseen hands, often calloused, dirty, and anonymous. Before the age of sewers, waste management relied on human endurance, improvisation, and nightly labor in conditions few today can imagine. As cities sleep peacefully today, trusting their plumbing to whisk away the day's waste, the legacy of those nightmen lingers beneath the streets, a silent testament to a time when sanitation depended not on infrastructure, but on the sweat of men working by lantern light.